Hello, students. This is Chapter 7 of Lifespan Development. We're going to be learning about information processing and a lot about memory. So starting off with information processing, our brain is an information processor. It's taking in a ton of data all of the time. So we learned in previous chapters about sensory inputs. We're getting all of our sensory inputs. We're getting the messages from our organs. We're getting our emotions. We're getting whatever is meaningful to us in the moment. We're aware of what our future plans are, whether it be long term or short term. And all of that is happening in our brain. And then we also have our working memory, our consciousness essentially, of what we're aware of at any given moment going as well. So as the brain is processing all of this information, it brings what it thinks is the most meaningful, or essentially what you have trained it over time to know is the most meaningful, front and center into your working memory. So with that, it takes processing speed. Processing speed is a very central part of this whole process. Most neurons fire anywhere between 200 to 400 times a second is what they're usually able to do. We have seen in some other creatures faster neuron transmissions, but for humans, that's about what we see when we measure it. Neuron processing speed increases overall with myelination. So this lets the signal get down the axon and then to the next cell a little bit quicker when it's myelinated. So it makes it more efficient for neural networks to be made from myelinated axons. Another big thing that improves processing speed, because if you remember from previous chapters, that myelination finishes up in the brain about at age 23 to 25. So another way that we increase processing speed continuously through the lifespan is making new networks. So when you learn a new hobby or build a new habit, at first it might take a lot of effort. For example, driving a car. If you've been driving a car for even 2 years, or maybe for some of us more than 2 years, probably, I can't do the math right now. I'm focused on lecture, but probably something like 20 years. Yeah, probably about 20 years now, actually. I did do the math in my head. So I've been driving about 20 years. I have a lot of networks around driving. So it's easy now to drive. I don't take as much cognitive energy. The neural networks are there, and so I can process that information pretty quickly. And you're building that as you're building those habits. Those networks don't exist when you first start to do something kind of unusual or out of the norm, like driving. Driving is a pretty unique thing to do that oftentimes humans are starting to do at like 14, 15, 16, that kind of thing. So another thing is that commonly used neurons also learn to send their message quickly. So if this neuron is part of a neural network that's very often used, whether it's a memory, whether it's a habit, whatever it is that it's usually doing, it learns that it's being used very often, and it essentially learns to take less energy, less inputs to send a message. Because every neuron to send a message needs enough energy of messages going into it. So neurons can learn over time, oh, I'm being used a lot for this thing. I will use less of my energy and send the message, even though I'm not getting as many inputs. And that speeds up processing a little bit too, when neurons know or kind of become a part of that network and enmesh within those networks. And so we've got multiple neurons, remember, thousands of neurons together making up these networks. So you can think of this process of making more networks kind of like these three pictures of roads. If you want to get to a certain kind of outcome, if you want to get to something happening, so starting your car, for example, or maybe it's processing and reading something in your book. Maybe it's something like activating your computer or remembering your password, something like that, right? So there is processes that have to happen to get to that point. You can think of the neural network getting to that process without myelination, kind of like this dirt road. It's going to get there, but it's going to be a little slower than this paved road, right? And so also here we have two pathways versus three pathways, so a bigger network. Let's say this image here, the putting in your password or remembering your password has all of these networks going to it. That means one or two of those might be a little faster, or it's a shorter route to get to it. So you've got a lot of messages and some of them are getting here faster, some of them a little slower, but that kind of thing helps with your processing speed. Again, think of these as like the axons coming in to activate that specific network. So this processing speed improves across childhood and through adolescence. So again, some of that is because of myelination. A lot of that is just because of what we train our brains to do with our neural networks, the habits that we're building, the memories, that kind of thing. So another thing that we see is working memory capacity is increasing as well. As the working memory speed increases, processing speed also increases. So they're both very related to each other because, again, they're both using the neurons, and especially those that are in our prefrontal cortex for working memory. So we do see slow declines begin in middle adulthood, but like we've talked about before, these declines can be managed or monitored, or basically managed or maintained so that they don't drop off steeply. If you continue using your brain more, if you're engaging with new things, if you're trying new things, these declines will either not happen or will happen much, much slower. So we can measure slow declines starting in middle adulthood, but oftentimes we don't see these declines until closer to later adulthood in life. Like a scientist could measure the speed decline, like your reaction speed declining. And we can actually see this in first person shooter players. For example, if you look at the ages of people who are doing first-person shooters as games for like in competitions, most of them are fairly young because they, one, are building the networks, playing these games a lot to be able to do it really well. So they've got a ton of networks to do their games, right? But also they have the myelination on their side and they have the health of their neurons on their side. So once they get into past about middle adulthood, their speed declines pretty dramatically. So I'm unfortunately dealing with that with just playing casual games with my kids now. Used to be so easy to beat them. I was so fast at doing things. I had a lot more practice too when I had the time to, and before I had kids. But now they have more time to practice. They have more networks, and they are faster at, say, competitive games against me. So kind of some interesting things to see there. So another big piece of information processing and a big piece of memory that we'll talk about is attention. So attention is simply the term we use to describe how we focus our mental resources on things. And so as we're focusing our mental resources on things, we can use that. It can be part of our working memory. It can be part of our information that we're processing at any time. So with that, there's a couple different kinds of attention. One is selective attention. Selective attention is when we focus on one aspect and ignore irrelevant things. So if you are in a crowded room with a friend and there's a bunch of people talking, focusing on their conversation with you, that is selective attention. You're ignoring what everybody else is saying and only focusing on that person. So again, depending on how your brain works, it might be easier or harder to focus on that one person. So let's say you have sensory input differences than your friend, it might be harder to block out and focus and selectively attend. Divided attention, on the other hand, is when you are focusing on more than one active stimuli. So in that room, you're kind of listening to all the conversations at once. You're trying to pick up on more than that one conversation. So you might do that intentionally if you're bored with the conversation you're having with your friend, or maybe you thought you heard something in the background. There was a funny noise, so you're trying to pay attention to both your friend and maybe that funny noise. That would be divided attention. Sustained attention is related to these as well. You could think of this as vigilance, and essentially it's just extended engagement with some object, some task, some event. So oftentimes I'm hoping that you have sustained attention during a lecture. So you're keeping your attention focused, you're processing the information, it's coming into your brain, you're using it, this kind of thing. And so we see the biggest developments in sustained attention happening in preschool years. They increase. A lot of that is simply down to the brain continuing to develop, make new pathways, and the practice you're getting. As you jump into school from not being in school before preschool, you have time to practice more sustained attention. That's one of the reasons hopefully a teacher will in preschool have a lot more play and less time for sustained attention versus in fourth grade, you're going to have a lot more expectation to have more sustained attention for a longer period of time because we're building those skills through practice. Another thing is executive attention. So this is things using the prefrontal cortex up here. You are planning, you are attending to goals, you are seeing errors that you're making or problems that you might encounter. You're kind of planning ahead. So if you are playing chess and you're thinking like 3 steps ahead, you are using executive attention. So this is monitoring progress, and this can be used in many things, right? If you're doing a piece of art, even if it's like, say, with Play-Doh in preschool, you're probably using executive attention. You are planning what you want to do with that. You see, oh, that didn't exactly work how I wanted, but we do this as adults as well. You could, even as an adult, you could play with the Play-Doh, right? But you could also know, oh, I have a paper I'm writing. I need to plan out time to do some work for it. I have to do some writing. Oh, I see that I'm doing some things wrong with grammar. Well, I'll plan to come back and fix that because I'm in a good flow of writing, things like that. So that's executive attention. And a lot of that is focusing your mental resources on specific goals overall. So with this, early children, so we're kind of jumping forward and back in the lifespan as we talk about these different things. And again, there's a lot of research in lifespan development on childhood through adolescence and less as we get into adulthood. So early children do struggle with the salient versus relevant dimensions of things that they attend to. Humans are attuned to novel stimuli. So a new bright flashing thing, a new sound, a new sign, a new something in the environment might possibly signal something useful or something dangerous. So we evolved to be able to turn our focus to it. So sometimes it's not a relevant new thing, right? So that ad on the side of the road is probably not very relevant to you most of the time as you're driving down the road. So you have learned to ignore that irrelevant stimuli. But early children, they don't have that practice yet. They are practicing it. They're getting better and better at it. So oftentimes they will have a hard time keeping sustained attention if there's something flashy or distracting present. So if you're at a playground and you want to tell a child that they shouldn't go on this specific part of the playground, they might not be listening to you, right? Because they are having a hard time focusing on the salient dimensions. So this does improve as we get to around ages 7 and then also beyond. And mostly it improves as we have some of that myelination happening, more practice using the different parts of our brain, like our prefrontal cortex. So it's a little bit of brain development and practice over time. Another thing is planfulness. Early children struggle with planning ahead. They often judge things haphazardly, making what seem like impulsive decisions because they're not really planning through, they're not using that sustained attention and processing the information around them. So, as an example, for a while, my youngest just wouldn't eat eggs. They didn't like the taste of them, they didn't like the texture of them. I tried a bunch of different ways, and they didn't want eggs. And so one morning, I was trying to ask them what they wanted to eat for breakfast. And I said, hey, do you want waffles or do you want eggs? Because I asked them, I usually give a third option as well. But they were judging haphazardly. They weren't paying full sustained attention. They were having a hard time bringing their mind to that focus. And they said they wanted eggs. And I knew they probably didn't. So that let me know, well, let's sit down. We'll talk, we'll focus. So take a breath, like look at me, listen, let's listen to the question again. Do you want waffles or eggs? And they did stop and think about it. And they're like, oh, actually, I want waffles. I said, ooh, something like, ooh, I don't want eggs. Now they're eating eggs, which is good because it's a useful protein for them. So as we get into adolescence, we see some other things. We see that attention is easier for adolescents. They're able to process information much faster than before. Their ability to shift their attention to things. So I'm paying attention to this. Now I pay attention to this, whether it's I'm paying attention to homework. Now I switch attention over here and I'm paying attention to my friend or something like that. This is improving throughout adolescence. And most of that is through practice. They've had all of childhood to practice these capacities and abilities, and it can continue to improve later on. With this, the automatic processing of that irrelevant information. So at the playground, there's a lot of sounds and noises going around. For a child, it's a little harder to automatically ignore those things. but you've had more practice by the time you're an adolescent, it's a lot easier to automatically ignore that irrelevant information. So your automatic processing of that is much quicker, takes much less cognitive energy to do that. That being said, this is also a time where we see a lot of adolescents trying to do what we call multitasking, try to do two things at the same time, which we'll talk about as being not possible for humans. It's possible in a few very select scenarios visually that we can, say, read a page, but also see other things around the focal area that we're reading. But basically, outside of that, multitasking is actually impossible. We can shift attention, so shift from one topic, one stimuli to another pretty quickly, but we actually see decreased performance. And so one thing that we're noticing from a lot of adolescents is that they're trying to do multiple things at the same time. They might be doing homework while watching Netflix. They might have YouTube on while listening to music, while doing their homework. And so we've seen a lot of abilities in school decline because they are trying to do all these things at the same time. Now, they're much more capable of doing that than they would have been as children, but the brain still cannot ignore all the irrelevant information. If there's an interesting part of a show, it's going to pull your attention away from your homework. If there's maybe too distracting of lyrics in a song and you want to start singing along, it's going to pull your attention away from your homework. And then when your attention's not on it, what you think you are reading, you're actually just processing at a very shallow level rather than a deeper level to make connections with things. So while you might have gone over that stuff on a page, it didn't actually go into your long-term memory. So with this, here's a couple of videos if you want to watch them. Actually, I think we will watch one of them because it's pretty short, but the other one is good too. So the second one is a good one, but let's watch this first one because it is pretty short.
Remember how science said that multitasking isn't real, that we can't do it? Well, science was wrong because there's one way you can do it, and you're probably doing it right now. Howdy folks, Trace here for D-News. Thanks for tuning in. The human brain is a complex and amazing piece of biological machinery. But there's this one thing that we all talk about doing that we really can't. Multitasking. Don't fight me on this. There are plenty of studies telling us that we cannot multitask. Our brains don't work that way. We can train ourselves to be really good at serial tasking, or doing one thing, changing gears, and then doing something else and then going back again. But carrying on a conversation while actively texting? No, can't do it. Driving and talking on the phone? We're not really good at splitting our attention either. But a new study from
Hopefully I just popped back up on the screen. But yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about with adolescents versus early children. So in adolescence, you're able to do a lot better job of the serial tasking. And so oftentimes adolescents are trying to do more of these serial tasks, whether it's watching Netflix and doing homework, but we've seen in a lot of different studies trying to test it in a lot of different ways with adults, adolescents, late adults, children, that humans actually can't do what we would actually call multitasking, do two totally separate tasks at the same time. That being said, we'll get back to it with the slide on adolescence. Something that's very passive for attention that you don't actually have to pay attention to, like simply music that isn't going to pull you out of your homework, that at the same time as doing your reading for your homework, that wouldn't be a problem. It's these things that are pulling your attention from one task to another task. You're not getting as much sustained attention. You are not processing it as deeply as we'll talk about with memory. And so it's not going to be as likely to be in your long-term memory. All right, back to the video.
From the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences finally found the human brain can multitask at seeing things. How it works relies first on how the eye collects information. When we look around, the eye sucks in light and sends it off to your brain box. The researchers call this visual sampling, and it's how we look at things all the time. Humans have a foveated visual system, which means the back of the eyeball has a divot full of cone cells. This is the clearest point in your visual field. Think of it like a spotlight. Your eye casts that spotlight over lots of things rapidly, shifting the gaze across a setting and sending all that visual data right into the brain. We do this because outside of that spotlight, point, things get kind of fuzzy. We're literally unable to take in a whole room without moving our eyes around. We can only clearly see where the foveal spot falls. The rest is there, but it's less vivid.
So a way to think about this is that the sensory processing data coming from that central point is hopefully at like 20/20 vision, and then it declines dramatically outside of that.
Foveal analysis is where the multitasking happens. Say you're looking at a menu. Your eyes will line up the foveal spot on each menu item to see it clearly. But if you don't go straight down the page, like a book, instead you hop around, aligning the spot with one thing and then another, skipping across the page. What's really happening is your brain is analyzing what you're reading and unbeknownst to you, using your peripheral vision to help you decide where to go next. Boom! Multitasking. Serial tasking slows everything down. If you're talking to me and reading a book, the conversation would slow way down and probably be unintelligible, and you would probably take forever to read one page. True multitasking can happen rapidly without one process affecting another. The researchers used tests to determine if the foveal analysis wasn't being interrupted or slowed by the peripheral selection. I always wanted to multitask, and now I found out that I've been doing it the whole time.
Right, so going back to one of our previous slides here, here is the brain, here is all of these axons. So while your consciousness, like what is in your brain, what you think is meaningful right now, is focused and you have things in your working memory, there are other background processes happening. You are processing a lot of information. And so some of that, just like this example with multitasking, the foveal analysis shows that, yeah, your visual center is analyzing exactly where you're looking. You are reading, you are comprehending the words, but at the same time, that peripheral vision is doing the same thing, is using some of those networks while you are focusing on some words to read other words outside of your working memory conscious experience. So that is a real example of multitasking. But again, for an adolescent, this process is getting better. So they're able to do it a little better in serial tasks, but actual multitasking is not possible with humans. So adolescents will often try it. We'll try to do things that are really cognitively intensive. Texting with someone is actually quite cognitively intensive, holding on that conversation, because you don't have body language to go off of. You don't have tone of voice to go off of. You will maybe misinterpret the message. There can be spelling mistakes. So you have to spend a lot of cognitive energy. So if you are carrying on an active texting conversation while you are also trying to read your homework, both of those are going to suffer. You're not going to do as well. And so with that, it's correlated with poorer memory, increased impulsivity, so that's also related to adolescent risk-taking, reduced brain volume. So for people who do this a lot, we see that the actual density of their axon branches and dendrites is lower, and also poorer self-regulation. So this is a habit to, if you do, try and break. So try and keep your attention on one thing and set your focus on that thing, as we'll talk about in memory and encoding, and for being able to store that memory. That is very important to focus that attention. So controlling attention is important for memory, for learning, for thinking, and for processing all of the information that is going on all around us at any given time. So in adulthood, we see that our skills in attention are very good. So we've got pretty good attention in adulthood. And after about middle adulthood, we generally do see a decline. Oftentimes this comes first in more difficulty ignoring irrelevant information. So we built that skill in early childhood, got better to adolescence. It was pretty good for a time, and then it starts to decline after about middle adulthood and gets worse into later adulthood. Also, doing more complicated tasks that take more cognitive effort, maybe something new, can be harder, but also more complicated tasks might make the losses more obvious. So if you see a friend of yours, maybe an adult friend or a late adult friend, trying to do a couple like complex processes, something like learning how to use a computer, it's going to be maybe a little bit harder for them because their processing speed is a little slow. Again, when we learn anything new, it's going to take more cognitive energy. If that cognitive energy, that literally the energy the cells are eating up to do these processes. If it's taking that, those cells can also be a little bit slower there into later adulthood. But in uh, early adulthood, middle adulthood, these skills for attention are really good, and we can maintain them for quite a while if we try to train them and try to use them. As we get into late adulthood, we see that selective attention is more difficult as well. So this goes back to that previous slide talking about more difficulty ignoring irrelevant information. So we have also the sustained attention, focused engagement with with the aspects of the environment. So as you're playing a game with friends, for example, like these individuals are in a park. So that takes some mental activity and it is a little bit slower. It's a little bit harder in late adulthood. And then a couple other things. Explicit memory are things like the facts and the experiences that the individual knows that happened to them. So what do you remember what happened on that trip to Alaska, for example? That would be an example of an explicit memory. So these decline as a person ages. So episodic memory. So I think I might have confused episodic and explicit here. So episodic is like an episode of your life. So you can think of it that way. Like if you were to watch a show of your life, the episode was your episodic memory. So where you were, what was happening, that kind of thing. Versus semantic memory is kind of like the facts that you know. So how many different kinds of car do you know? What do you know about the parts of a neuron? How many bones of the human body? That would be semantic memory. Then explicit memory is kind of a mixture with the facts and experiences that an individual can consciously be aware of at any given time. But again, all of these are declining is kind of the key piece. And an implicit memory is something that is a memory, but we often don't think of it as a memory. If you've ever heard someone say something like, you don't forget how to ride a bike, it's an implicit memory. It's a procedure, a routine that's so automatic. Using a spoon is an implicit memory. Now, that's not to say that you can't have something like Parkinson's make it difficult to use a spoon, but you have the memory. You know how you should be able to be holding the spoon. So this is the least effective by aging. And then working memory and perceptual speed, these are declining. And so these are very linked. So your working memory is that conscious awareness of what's happening right now. You're able to think about what has happened in the past. What are your goals for the future? These kinds of things. We'll watch very shortly a video on working memory to make this a lot more clear if it's still a little unclear to you. But hopefully, while you're watching this, you have already taken a look at the textbook and have an understanding of a lot of these concepts. As we start talking about memory in more detail, stop and think, maybe write in your notes really quickly. What's something that you have a hard time remembering or something that you wish you were better at remembering? So pause the video, write a couple things down, and hopefully we go over a few ideas that will help you remember those things in the future. So pause the video now and come back in a minute or two. All right, so hopefully you have a couple things that you do wish that you were better at remembering. So as a review, this is the structure of the brain neurons, the interneurons inside the brain. We have here the dendrites that are kind of the receiving antenna of these messages, the cell body that does the things cells do. So remember, neurons take energy, they have waste, they do everything that a normal cell does. And this is the axon, the main delivery system for the message, and you can have lots of axon branches, you can have lots of dendrites connecting to different things. So the key to memories is the connections that our brains make. So just like in learning or habit formation, neurons basically make connections and send messages to other neurons. And that's what memories are as well. So let's look at a couple specific areas in the brain that are really central for memory formation. Here you can see them listed on this image. So the memory, any given memory is made up of lots of brain areas connected together, essentially kind of replaying that memory for you. So some of the same neurons that were active during the time of the original event will be active as you are trying to remember it. So it's a lot fewer than were active during the actual event, probably 5% or so, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. So the hippocampus is a really important part. You could think of the hippocampus and the amygdala area as kind of where the inside out characters live inside your brain. Um, I think it's a great movie and a great analogy to especially things like memory. So we'll probably bring it up as an example a couple times. I'm sure they had some psychologists and neurologists and biopsychologists on call as they developed that movie. So with this, the hippocampus, it's kind of the direction of memory storage. It helps your brain to know where is this memory? How can I trigger this memory? Where should this memory be stored? It helps with that process to try and make those neurons become a memory. The amygdala is a big emotional component of our brain, and a lot of our memories have emotional components. Whether it was a memory of that time you were in a haunted house and you were really scared, whether it was a time of a really good first date and you felt really happy, right? Or a time that you lost someone in your life and you felt really sad. These emotional components are added to that memory. So very often the amygdala is active during memories because almost everything that we do also runs through the amygdala at the same time. So there's always some, not always, but very often some emotional component as we're considering new ideas versus having an experience. There's very often some emotional component. So it's a very important component of memory. The olfactory bulb is also way in here. It's not actually listed on this one. It's about in this area, and that's for smell. Smell is a very strong sense tied to memory. And so with that, smells, oftentimes if you smell something, it'll remind you of someone or some place. So I think I've given the example in class of my child saying, "Oh, this place smells like grandma's house," or like a certain scent smells like grandma's house, like a candle that they often burn type of thing. So the olfactory bulb is really tied to a lot of different memories, kind of like the amygdala, even though it's, say, the hippocampus that's directing where the memories are stored. Some other specific areas, the infotemporal cortex or IT cortex does a lot of different visual functions. So there's a lot of visual area here in your brain that are looking for patterns, looking for faces, looking for shapes, and also some of your sensory memories here. So there's a lot of different areas that are connecting. If you are, say, learning to ride a bike, there are areas that are dependent on balance and vision to help you remember what you are doing. And eventually that might become kind of second nature, so you don't have to consciously think about how am I riding a bike. And the somatosensory cortex are the areas right about here that are giving us that touch sensation. And so oftentimes in our memories, we have physical sensations happening, whether it's temperature, pain, touch, whatever it might be, that is also part of those memories. So all of these areas are very tied to a lot of different memories, even though for certain memories, some might be more or less tied. It's usually the hippocampus kind of directing the areas to become a memory. So with this, these many areas make a memory. So this is a good image to kind of think about how connected the brain actually is. So you've got visual cortex, language cortex is over here. You've got prefrontal cortex up here. There's somatosensory cortex about here in the middle on the outside. So your hippocampus will communicate with the amygdala, which will also communicate with the prefrontal cortex, which will also communicate with the olfactory bulb way in here in the middle, and then in the IT cortex, which is a couple components over here, the cerebellum overall, the outside wrinkly portion, and the somatosensory cortex. So all of those are firing and active as you are having some experience. So as you're having the experience of trying to learn to ride a bike the first time, or you're having the experience of a first kiss, or you're having the experience of sitting in class, learning and listening. For any of those given tasks, different neurons around your brain are going to be firing. And so many areas connected those areas that are connected will become the memory. So it's generally we see in humans, it looks like we've got better measurements of, say, like rats and mice on this, but it looks like less than 10% of the neurons become a memory. It's probably somewhere around like 4 or 5%. But you can see all the axons. This is a cool picture of all the axons in this individual's brain. And so there's a lot of connections all over between these neurons. For any of those given axons and axon branches at the end of them, there's a ton of dendrites connecting to them. So there is a lot of networking happening in the brain. And so your memory of any given event is probably about something like 5% of those neurons just kind of replaying that memory. In a way, you're kind of like reliving it. And also that leads to why some memories can change over time as well. So let's say you had a first kiss. At first, the relationship started out great. Everything was happy. And so all your memories about that person were happy. But then you go through a really bad breakup. So maybe after, your memories are tinged with sadness or even anger. And so now, when you think back to those memories, rather than just being happy, you have new emotional components and your memory has shifted, has changed a little bit. So that amygdala in here has now changed that memory to be slightly more negative than it was in the beginning. So memories can shift and change because they are just neurons re-going through some of the processes that you experienced. So there can be slight alterations to those memories. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in the class as we go on and talk about the limitations of how much our memories can shift because there are limitations. It's not completely, you can't create really outside of your normal life experience false memories. So we'll talk about that as we continue on. But first, let's make some connections by doing an activity on memory. So one of the most common ways that we can use our memory and try to get better with our memory is called mnemonics. Mnemonics are essentially just strategies to learn to be better with your memory, little tools and tricks. So part of this class, part of hybrid activities in my hybrid classes will be about learning some mnemonics. So one that we will practice, even though we're kind of virtual right here, you can still practice this method of loci. And I've heard it pronounced method of loci, method of loci, method of, there's another way I've heard it pronounced as well. So I'm not actually sure exactly how it's pronounced, but this is how it's spelled. Loci, loci, yeah, there's another one. So when thinking about the method of loci, the method of loci, the method of location, you might have heard this called the journey method or also the mind palace. If you've ever watched the recent show Sherlock Holmes with Benedict Cumberbatch, they talk about their mind palace. That's what this is. It's a mnemonic. It's a trick to try and connect new information to something that you already know really well. So to do this, think of a place. Think of a place that you know really, really well, someplace big enough that you can at least like move around in it. So a house that you've lived in is a good example because there's different rooms, different things in the different rooms, furniture around, that kind of thing is a really good thing to do with this. You can use just a single room. So if you have a specific room in your house, like probably a bedroom that you know really well and you can think of where everything is in it, that would be a good example. Also, it could be a bigger place, like it could be a park, like a trail that you usually go on in this park. The more like variation there are in this kind of place, the better because it makes it a little easier to connect new information. So essentially what you imagine is I've got this floor plan here on the screen. You imagine as you walk through this house that there are things, whether it be new numbers, like a phone number that you need to remember. You can connect pieces of the phone number with things in the house. If it is something like a shopping list, you connect the different items for shopping into the different items in the house. So as an example, I'll show a list of random words and describe how I would do this. This might be something similar to like a shopping list or some new facts that you have to remember and associate with this place. So here I've got bottle, cup, paper, sand, box, fork, staple book, top, glass, lamp, boat. You could just kind of repeat those and try to remember them that way. But this mnemonic, the method of loci, is a really powerful way to connect this new information, these new 12 random words, with something that you already know really well. So what I remember this from is actually the house that I lived in high school. So I lived in Indiana, and for some reason, I just remember that house the best of all of the places that I've lived. So I imagine as I come up to the house, I'm imagining that I'm getting off the school bus at the end of school, and I'm coming up to the house, and outside the house there is a bottle. I might even visualize it as being a bottle of Mountain Dew. So I'm literally visualizing myself moving up to the front door. There's a bottle of Mountain Dew outside the door. I open the door, and on the ground inside the door, there is a cup, right? So those are the first two words. And there's a bottle, there's a cup. That makes a little bit of sense. And I'm making a story about myself walking through the house. As I walk into the house, I see the living room. There's a table there in the living room. And I remember all these things, right? I already know what the house looks like. I know where pictures on the wall are, where the furniture is. And so it's really easy for my brain to think of, oh, the coffee table. What's on the coffee table? Oh, a stack of paper, or it might be one single paper, but something to help me remember paper. And then I continue walking through the house. I'm going maybe past the back door, and there is sand on the ground. Maybe a sibling went in a sandbox and drug sand into the house. So as I'm walking through the house, I've seen the bottle, I've seen the cup, I've seen the paper, I see the sand. As I come into the kitchen, there's a box on the table. Amazon only sold books when I was in high school, but maybe it's an Amazon box. And then next, as I go into the kitchen, I see a fork just sitting on the counter. So this is how to connect new information with someplace that you know really well already. So if it's something like a phone number, you might take, say, the area code. And then as you walk past, let's say you walk in your front door, there's this cabinet here. Maybe there's a clock or something on top of that cabinet, and it has the first three numbers of the area code. That's a really easy way to chunk those three numbers and make it useful or interesting or fit into your already made networks. And so that's essentially what you're doing. You are taking new information that you are learning, some random list of words, some random numbers, well, random to you now, or a shopping list, and you are connecting them with a network that already exists in your brain. So some people who do memory competitions competitively make their own mind palace of a place in their mind that is kind of set up to learn things and connect things to, but you can just use the method of loci with a place that you already know. It's a good way to start it. It doesn't take that first cognitive energy of imagining a place and imagining it enough that you can connect things to it. No, use some place that you already know, whether it be a room, a park, a house, someplace that you can kind of move around in that it takes very little effort to think about. So I will show you a slide, and I'm going to show it for 1.5 minutes. I will time myself with this. So after that 1.5 minutes of you reading that list, I want you to pause the video and try to write them all down in the order that they were. All right, so I'm gonna put the words on the. So first, I guess before you see the words, you try to decide a place that you will use for your method of loci, and then I'll put the words up, and then we will do the 1.5 minutes for you to learn those words, and then pause the video, write down all the words in the correct order, and see how many you get right. Okay. So hopefully now you have a place in mind. Here are the words. Got about 30 seconds left. All right, stop with the list. Now write down those words in the best order that you can. You can pause the video right now to take the time to write them down in the correct order, and we'll see how many you got correct. All right, this is the correct list of words. How many did you get right? Usually I find that we might have in a class of, say, 30 students, there might be like 3 or so that will get all of them, and then we will have maybe 5 or so that will get, say, 9 or 10 of them, and then a lot of students will get up to 7, so like the majority, but then we'll also have some students who get maybe 4 or 5 or even 3. So we have kind of a normal distribution around there where a few students do remember all of them, a few students only remember a few of them, but most somewhere around 6 or 7 in that order. So this is a really useful tool, a really strong mnemonic, because partially you are visualizing, and our memories are really good with visualizing. You are connecting to things that you already know really well, and that really helps your neurons. And oftentimes you might make like a story up about these things. Like in my original example, I had the sand. Why was the sand there? Well, because one of my siblings had tracked sand in the house. That makes it a lot easier to remember because it's connected to more things. So that is the point of the method of loci, is to try and connect new information with some place that you already know really well. And that's essentially the whole idea behind the method of loci, the mind palace. You have this place that you are connecting new information to, whether it's a shopping list, whether it's numbers. I actually do use this for shopping lists. I mean, I have it like in an app on my phone as well, but I use this method for shopping lists to help me remember as well. So with this, how else could you use this mnemonic? There are a lot of different types of mnemonics, and essentially all of their points are to make more connections so you remember things better. So consider how else you might use this in your own life, and I do hope you do try this mnemonic. Depending on which class you're in, we will be doing more mnemonics, or you'll have it as activities. So do take some time to really consider which mnemonics might be helpful for you. Look at that list of what you wish that you could remember better or you have a hard time remembering. There are mnemonics that might help. Now, every single mnemonic might not work for you. I've tried some for remembering names and faces. So I remember faces really well, but I have a hard time remembering names. So I've tried a bunch of different mnemonics for remembering names, and some have worked okay. But for me, really just the repetition is the only thing that has helped with that. I haven't found a good connection trick with a mnemonic, and that's the case. All of our brains are different. So this method of loci works for a lot of people, but it might not work for you. So try out this one, try out other ones, use this list and other activities that we're doing in class to try and learn some more mnemonics and test them out. So, and with that, what other brain processes are using a similar method when learning? Well, a lot of them. When we learn a new habit, when we're getting positively reinforced, we are literally making connections stronger. When you are weightlifting, you are making the neuron connection stronger from you telling a muscle to move to moving more muscle cells, having more muscle cells contract. So this basic brain process of neural connections is really dependent on a lot of things in our lives are very dependent on these neural connections. So let's talk more specifically about memory and types of memory. So when we think about memory, what we're talking about is the retention of information over time. And this is important for cognitive development over our lifespan. We see both facets of cognitive development impacting memory, memory impacting facets of cognitive development. So these are very important. Sensory memory is a really brief memory format that is just the information from the senses about the world. Depending on the sense, it either lasts an instant to just a few seconds, like milliseconds to a couple seconds. So it depends on which sensory organ you're getting. Your eyes are getting a pretty brief sensory memory. Your ears are fairly brief. If I'm not mistaken, your olfactory and tongue cells the taste buds are giving a little bit longer of a sensory memory, but this is literally just the time that your sensory organs are going to the sensory cortex and that it's hanging on to that sensation for just a very brief time. And then if it doesn't pull it into what's called your working memory, you don't even feel it. So Right now, you're probably wearing a shirt, so you might feel sleeves on your arms, maybe your shoulders. But until I mentioned that, you probably didn't feel it, right? Those sensory organs were still sending the signal, but your brain was not actually pulling it into your conscious awareness. That sensory memory was going in and out pretty much immediately. But your brain is processing that information all of the time. So that is sensory memory. Another type of memory, with this iconic memory, this is actually why you can write your name if you do really, really quickly with a sparkler, because you are holding on to the sensation of light just long enough with your sensory memory that your brain essentially remembers the whole track. That's also why, if you've seen in cameras, so if you've ever used like a video camera that has a very fast refresh rate, LED lights, like I've got LED lights around me, they're actually blinking all the time. Right now, all the lights around me are blinking very, very fast, but my sensory memory for light is long enough that I don't recognize that blinking. So the refresh rate of the light is faster than the basically refresh rate of my eyes for seeing that blinking. But a camera can see it. That's also how like your TV works. It's changing the image very, very quickly. But even though it's the image changing and it's the pixels jumping from here to here to here as someone's like walking across the screen, because of your sensory memory, you see it as a smooth movement. So short-term memory is a different thing. So sensory memory is very, very brief. So no more than like a second, depending on the sense that you're talking about. Short-term memory is the information that we kind of hold on to for about 30 seconds without doing anything with it. So that list of words, if you didn't try to grab onto that list of random words in the mnemonic activity, it would just kind of disappear, as new information comes in, you could think of it pushing out the old information. So short-term memory is that stuff that we kind of hold on to for about 30 seconds and then it just disappears on its own. So a 2-year-old can remember about a 2-digit sequence, and then a 7-year-old can remember about a 5-digit sequence in their short-term memory without trying to like repeat it and without trying to connect it to something, just with their short-term memory. We do see dramatic gains in early childhood as the brain is figuring out how to wire itself up, and we do see some steady, slower gains as we get into the teenage years. And at about middle of the teenage years, end of the teenage years, that short-term memory is about as good as it will be for the rest of your life until we see some declines in later adulthood if you're not using your memory. So, short-term memory is passive. This is just happening. Your brain is just doing short-term memory. You are not trying to grab onto something. If you're trying to grab onto some information, now we're talking about working memory, which we'll get to in just a minute. But short-term memory is totally passive. Your brain is doing this automatically. It's like things appearing and disappearing off of shelves. So, some new information comes up. You've got books on a shelf. So I'm just looking at this picture right here of Dory. So new information is there. New information is gone. New information is there. New information is gone. And again, it's about 20 to 35 seconds for this passive things to come in and leave your brain. It seems like we have maybe 7 spaces. So if you're thinking about the or the shelf example, 7 spaces to hold information. But again, it's totally passive because we always have more information coming in. I talked about the method of loci a little bit ago, or loci, and or loci, and now we're talking about something different. So if you didn't grab onto that, that has totally left your short-term memory a while ago. So with that being said, we can improve this short-term memory by chunking things together, basically making bigger units out of multiple things. So oftentimes we do this when we're remembering a phone number. We usually remember the area code as a chunk of information, and then the next 3 numbers as a chunk of information, and then the last 4 numbers as a chunk of information. You can do chunking with a lot of different things. It has to be kind of related to one another, and you'll get better if you practice it. But chunking is a good way to put things together, and you can use it with other memory strategies too. So you could use chunking plus the method of loci for remembering more things. Another thing that can help your short-term memory is to kind of keep things in the short-term memory by rehearsing it. As you start to rehearse it, you're moving it into working memory, and then it's a little more likely it will jump into long-term memory. So working memory. We've mentioned this a couple times. It's a really critical piece of this whole puzzle. Think of this as your mental workbench. So if we go back to the Inside Out example, where those characters are standing, all the buttons on front of the console, maybe I should honestly change this picture to a picture of the Inside Out characters. All those buttons on the console, that is the mental workbench. It is the place where you are making decisions, you are manipulating new information, you're solving problems, you're focusing on things, you're understanding language. A lot of this is happening in the prefrontal cortex. And we are using our working memory all the time in life. If you are conscious and awake, you are using your working memory. To try and interpret what I'm saying right now, you're using your working memory. When you're trying to ignore the dog in the background or something like that, you're using your working memory. And our working memory capacity improves all the way through adolescence into adulthood. And again, a lot of that is down to the myelination of the neurons and the networks that we are making throughout our brain. So if you've seen Inside Out 1, you see the console kind of grow over time in Inside Out 1, and then in Inside Out 2 at puberty, they get an even bigger console, so a bigger mental workbench. It's actually pretty similar to kind of how our brains develop over time with the working memory. And other cognitive capacities are influencing working memory, right? So information processing, your working memory is the things that you're consciously aware of. So I see on the camera I'm looking at right now, there's a green light and a red light. So the green light says, yes, it is recording. The red light shows, yep, there is power to it. So I can see those. I'm getting that sensory input. A minute ago, it was coming into my short-term memory and just going away. Now I'm working with it. I'm using it as an example. It's now in my mental workbench. It's something that I'm aware of and I'm talking about. So let's watch this video about working memory. We won't watch the whole thing, so we'll watch up to about 7 minutes, but there is a little activity at the beginning of this. Do follow along and see if you can remember the couple things that they ask you to remember.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk. And I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay, we're not talking to each other, we're facing forward, we're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, and so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting. And he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pull some of that in as we need it. Mixes it, processes it, in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie. Or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Okay? Now, working memory capacity is our ability to leverage that. Our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride. You up for that? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words, and I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down. Just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. 184. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you were wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards. You should have started with Z. All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words? Okay. Typically, we end up with about less than half, all right, which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down in 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Okay? And it's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome. Okay? Working memory allows us to investigate our current experience as we move forward. It allows us to make sense of the world around us. Okay? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that. So I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Okay? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. Okay, it used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving, all right? Now, we can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it. When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? Okay. You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay? Right? Have you ever forgotten your keys? Have you ever forgotten your car? Have you ever forgotten your kids? Okay? Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? All right? So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say, okay? All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies.
So with this, feel free to finish watching the rest of this. It is a really great video overall, but hopefully that gives you a lot better sense of what we're talking about with working memory, what we can do with it. So it is this mental workbench. Again, you can use the example of the Inside Out characters with their console. And we're taking those sensory memories, those short-term memories that might just stay there and kind of float away, and we're starting to work with them. It's the things that you're consciously working with, you're consciously aware of. You could kind of say that your working memory is essentially where you are living in your conscious mind. So with that being said, the study of consciousness is a whole other separate thing, but definitely connected to working memory. So with that, hopefully you have a lot better sense of working memory. At age 8, it seems like we can only hold that lower end of the spectrum, like 2 to 3 chunks of information in our working memory. Then by the time we're getting more myelination in our brain, by the time we've built up more networks and we have more practice with our memory, as adults, we can hold closer to 4 to 5 chunks of information in that working memory. So when you have a good working memory, your language ability is generally better, math skills are generally better, your problem solving ability is generally better because you're able to process more things at the same time. Again, whatever working memory capacity you have now, if you don't use it, it will start to decline. Your neurons will literally stop being as connected and lose some of those capacities. But also, if you want to work on them, your neurons will learn, hey, I have to use more energy, I have to make more connections. If you do practice tasks and use your working memory, learning new things is a good example of that. It will increase over time. So a lot of the things we've already talked about in class with what to do in late adulthood to keep your mind active, that is affecting working memory because all of these components are, again, working together, networking together to allow working memory to occur. So with working memory, this is also tied with attention. If you are trying to remember something, you have to attend to it. So if you're not paying attention to it, well, it's just going to go through your sensory memory and be gone. So working memory is where an adolescent, for example, is processing their emotion, their reasoning, what is going to happen, what does this look my crush is giving me, what does that mean? I'm trying to think of something clever to say. All of this is happening in working memory. And you might have had this kind of experience. When you are having a face-to-face conversation, like these two adolescents here are having, it might be easier to interpret things, to plan out what you're going to say, versus when you're having a text conversation, you might wonder, oh no, are they being sarcastic? Are they being passive-aggressive? Did they actually mean something slightly different? Was this a misspelling, or is this what they really meant? You need a lot more working memory processing for interpreting a text conversation than a conversation in person. In person, you have body language, you have tone of voice, you have their facial expressions, which I guess would be a component of body language, but there's a lot more information for you then to process in your working memory for that conversation. Versus here, you have some words on a screen. You have emojis that might have kind of a standard meaning, but is that how they're using them? Are they using them sarcastically? Right? So you have to use your working memory a lot more. So this is something that can be a challenge for adolescents as they are trying to do things. This is also one of the reasons, say, like texting while driving is so much worse than even like calling on the phone while driving versus talking to someone in the car. In the car, talking to someone, if they're maybe an adult or a older teen sitting in the front seat, oftentimes they'll notice traffic getting heavier, they'll quiet down, they'll stop talking for a minute, they'll pause the conversation versus someone on the phone or the kids in the back will not do that. They will just keep going because they don't know what's going on around you. And then a text, you don't get any of the tone of voice. You don't get any of their loudness or their quietness. All you have is these words. So one, you have to focus your attention on that. You have to use your working memory to process that information. So it takes a lot of working memory to do our day-to-day tasks. But we have this working memory. It has these capacities. So if you want to increase any of these abilities, that'll also help with your working memory. You can directly do activities to build your working memory by trying to do things with it. Learning new memory skills will help with your working memory because you're essentially working it out. Work out your working memory. And so this is different than long-term memory. So a lot of what we've talked about so far are building up to then what do we do with this information to put it into long-term memory. So if we continue the analogy of the Inside Out movie to long-term memory are those big stacks of memory balls in that movie. So for us in our brain, the long-term memory is the relatively permanent and pretty large capacity amount of memories that we can retain for a long period of time. So these are memories that may or may not be accessed over years, right? So you might not until I mention it right now, you might not have many memories like in your working memory of your 5th birthday party. But when I mention that, you might have some memories about it. You might not though, right? Maybe you do remember your 11th birthday party. So our long-term memory capacity increases across middle and late childhood, and it probably does grow in adolescence too, but not to as great of a degree. So with this, the long-term memory is, again, those networks of neurons that were active during that time. So they can eventually fade. So going back to the Inside Out example, the memory marbles in that movie, they kind of just fade away into dust. That can happen to our memories and long-term memory as well. If the neurons aren't being activated and used very often, we can lose those memories. So, or not have the hippocampus know where to direct us to access that memory. So the more you are thinking about or using the memory or trying to recall a memory, the more easy it will be to remember it. So there's a couple different components that your book talks about related to long-term memory and working memory. So working memory is doing this central executive functioning. The visuospatial sketchpad, you can think of that as like visual information. Phonological loop is sound and language information. The episodic buffer, you can think of that like the things that are going on around you. So you're processing these all at the same time. And usually as you are processing what's happening now, you are also recalling things from your long-term memory to work in your working memory. So you can think of this as the Inside Out characters calling up one of the memory balls. Maybe I should make watching Inside Out a prerequisite for this chapter, but essentially they're calling up those memory balls to see something that happened in the past. That is something that your working memory is doing. It's using that to process what's happening now. So implicit memory is a type of long-term memory that's really special and different. It is a memory without any kind of conscious recollection. So let's say you learned how to ride a bike. You might remember the process of learning how to ride a bike, that it was scary for you, that you had to have training wheels, maybe you got hurt or something like that. You probably have like episodic memories of this. But the process of riding a bike is an implicit memory, the memory of how to do this skill, because for a lot of these kinds of skills, whether it's using a spoon, whether it's how to type on a keyboard, whether it's riding a bike, whether it's how to drive a car now, these are all built into, sort of your motor memory, right? Your muscle memory is essentially what we describe as an implicit memory. So this is something that is part of long-term memory. It's based on skills that you have, actual body movements oftentimes, and you don't have to consciously think about it, but your networks in your brain run that and they know how to do these things. Explicit memories are those things that we usually think of as memories. So implicit memories are memories, but when we talk about memory, oftentimes people are referring to explicit memories, like your conscious memory of a fact or an experience. So like when I said, can you remember your fifth birthday? That would be an example of an explicit memory. So most research shows that explicit memories, before we're about age 2, fade away. So it seems like very young children, so if you look at this chart here, it does seem like very young children can remember things, and when they're about 2 years old, they can remember about the year before that. But when they're about 6 months old, it seems like they might only remember up to a day. Again, some of these things are really hard to detect, but part of the process here is that the brain is learning how to make memories. And so as the brain is learning how to make memories, it gets better and better at that. By the time you're about 3, it's pretty good at making memories, but it might not have held on to some of those memories before you were 3. So it's very rare for people to have memories earlier than the average is like 4.5 for a first memory. But again, there's a range. Some people will remember before that. Some people's first memories will be after that. So if you're anywhere from, say, 2.5 is kind of the earliest that I've heard that are convincing that it is a first memory, to about 7. That's about the range of first memories for most people. Mine is at, I it's still a little unclear. It was from a family vacation that I took when I was in early childhood, and it's still a little unclear if that was a family vacation the summer that I was 4.5 or 5.5. So, and even based on pictures, we went to pretty similar places. So it actually could be a memory that's a mix of both of those two places because it's a pretty similar thing. We went camping, um, and I climbed up into like a hollow tree. So that's one of my first memories. So another thing with memory is accuracy. As your brain is learning how to wire up to make a memory, your accuracy improves over childhood. So preschoolers' memory is not as good at being accurate, so it is more susceptible to misleading or incorrect information, to being nudged to remember things slightly differently. And so this is really relevant when prompting for events. You might prompt something about the friends that they were playing with at school. If you use the wrong name, maybe now they do say that they remember playing with that child, even though later you find out that that child was actually sick that day. So you can lead to distorted or incorrect memories easier in earlier childhood than into later childhood because the brain is getting better over time at making memories. And this does hold some pretty important this is pretty important if we're talking about things like law, eyewitness testimony, any kind of abuse of a child and a trial around that. So it's not a fun topic to discuss, but it is an important thing in relation to childhood memory development. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But autobiographical memories are kind of the memories of a story. So the kinds of things you would write in an autobiography. So who was your first grade teacher? What happened on your favorite vacation? And these kinds of things. We would call those autobiographical. And they'd basically be the things you would write about. So from the years of 3 to 5, we're doing better and better at remembering what happened where at specific times. As we get older and through childhood, we get more specific details. And again, that's because we literally have more connections in our brain that are making the memory. Also, by the time you're 7 versus 5 versus 3, you already have enough memories to connect that with. Right? So if it's your first camping trip, well, this is all new, really different. If it's your second camping trip, you can connect the new memories to the old memories. If it's your third camping trip, you can connect and see similarities, right? So it's easier to make those memory networks the more experience you have with making memories. So that's one of the big reasons why our memory is getting better over childhood. So with this, let's jump back to that not fun topic of talking about how to ask questions to children of potential abuse. So here are a bunch of links in the slideshow. Feel free to click through to any of those. I will talk about some main key takeaway points from all of these, but if you want additional information, these are some really good links to go to for that additional information. So like I mentioned, it is fairly easy to help a child remember in a slightly distorted way. So remembering something that didn't quite happen the way that they say, playing with a friend that they weren't actually playing with, these kinds of things. And we'll talk about some of the limitations of false memories in a second in relation to this. But when you're asking questions of children who you think might have been victims of abuse, ask open-ended questions. So like my example earlier, of asking, hey, did you play with James or did you play with Jenny? Like that's a very close-ended question, right? That would be a yes or a no, and that might alter their responses because maybe it wasn't James, maybe it was Jenny, or maybe it wasn't Jenny, it was James, but the names are similar, maybe the kids look similar, and so it's easy for the kid to switch that in their brain. So questions like, how did it happen? What happened? Who was there? How does it make you feel? These are really open. This lets the child go and talk about their own experience, put things out there. And so social service workers are trained to do these kinds of things too. You would hope that police would be trained to do these things. Lawyers know about these kind of closed and open-ended questions when asking children these kinds of things as well. But asking these kind of open-ended, non-leading questions are some of the best ways to get a clearer picture of what's going to happen. And another hard thing, especially with very early children, is their understanding of language is still building. So they might be using words in slightly incorrect ways and lead to, say, a misunderstanding from you or from other people. So it can be a tough thing, and it's a very important thing. If you think a child's a victim of abuse, you definitely need to figure that out so you can protect that child. So other open-ended questions that aren't leading are, how does the other person react? Like helping prompt them as they're going through the story, but not leading them any specific way. Tell me about your relationship with this person. How do you see your future? How do you see your future with that person? So these kinds of things are a lot more open-ended. Let the child fill in all of those blanks rather than you putting things in there. So don't ask leading questions. These are some examples of the questions you should not ask. Was blank what happened? Did this happen? Isn't it true that blah, 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 blah? Would you agree that blah, 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 blah? Honestly, would you agree that blah, blah, blah? That's probably a hard thing for especially a young child to understand. What are you even asking there? Any declarative sentence followed by right, correct, is that correct, is that right? That's a closed-ended question. That's a yes or a no. Not a good question to ask in this kind of situation. So again, I've got a bunch of links here to suggest how you can ask questions of children of potential abuse. Go through those, but the main takeaway points are open-ended questions. This is something that is very important, and memory can be a hard thing for younger children. So figuring out what is actually happening is very important because you want to protect children. So with that being said, feel free, if you need to pause the video right now, take a quick break. I know this is an important topic, but it can be a lot. So if you need to take a quick break, definitely do that. But hopefully you do remember this idea of asking open-ended questions. All right, so we will talk about executive function and how that is related to information processing and memory overall. So executive function is kind of what we call the higher level cognitive processes that are linked to things that we're doing in our prefrontal cortex across development. So in late childhood, we see a lot more advances in the prefrontal cortex. We see cognitive inhibition, which is basically stopping an action. So you might have a habit to do something. Maybe at recess, you always play something. So your default would be to go play that thing. But your cognitive inhibition would be like, oh no, my friends are over there. Today, I'll go do that. Cognitive flexibility is shifting your attention to another topic or another goal. Goal setting specifically is an executive function. And then also delay of gratification. So knowing, if I wait a little bit longer, I'll get more marshmallows, for example. That's an example of an executive function. And this is getting better through late childhood, and it is also improving throughout adolescence. So a lot of this is down to the myelination of the brain as well as just practice. As you practice these skills, they're going to get better. And a lot of times we're demanding more and more from children as they get into adolescence to be able to do these things. So those kinds of demands to be able to do delay of gratification allows them to practice it. So these are all linked to prefrontal cortex development. And I want to show a brief video about how this can play out in schools and how it's relevant for a lot of our life skills.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
So that's a point that is sometimes brought up, especially when you are doing like trying to get your policy funded or this new kind of education program funded. A lot of things really come down to, well, how can we sell this as something that can be helpful for businesses, for companies, for the GDP of the economy of our country. So on top of that, these skills, these executive functioning skills are important for just our daily interactions with people and living life and enjoying life. So, but yeah, a lot of times, especially with like early childhood education programs and making shifts to make more effective ones, this is kind of the argument what we've got to make because it's true. It does improve the performance of the workforce. So it's going to improve GDP of a country. It's going to make businesses more money. So that is sometimes the kind of argument you've got to go with to get these kind of really good education programs funded.
Just look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this? A toolbox.
A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles.
Safety goggles.
Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on, a child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn.
Cube.
But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7, and +4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas.
So hopefully with looking at this specific example here, you can see how many areas are working. So as we're talking about information processing, as we are talking about memory, all of these things are happening at the same time. The myelination, again, in the brain in early childhood is here, and then it's kind of happening here, and then in adolescence it's kind of happening here, and then early adulthood it's finishing up over here. But there's myelination happening all the time. So these areas are getting faster. They're getting more dedicated connections. The brain's figuring out how to make those connections and how to do it well. So that is a really important piece of our development over time, is the improvement of these executive function skills. So one of the most important changes in adolescent cognition are these executive functionings. Adolescents are a lot better at managing their thoughts, setting goals, self-control, a lot better than early children, and it's still improving. They're still getting specific practice, and a lot of this is down to the development of the prefrontal cortex. So cognitive control, it was talked about there in the video as inhibitory control. So you're controlling your attention, you're controlling your focus, you're reducing any interfering thoughts, things that could be distracting to you, and also your cognitive flexibility is related to your control. If you can control and switch over to something else, that is very helpful. This is really important for decision making. So in adolescence, they're making a lot of decisions that are very important for the rest of their life. So are they going to pay attention in their classes? What are they going to major in? Are they going to start college? Are they going to go into the various trades? So older adolescents are generally better at making decisions than a younger adolescent. So if you look at someone in 12th grade, they're generally better at it than an 8th grader. If you look at an 8th grader, they're generally better at it than a 5th grader. So they are getting better at this process. And with that being said, we can also expect and kind of help support adolescents in making more decisions by knowing that they can make more decisions as they're developing these capacities. And the only way that they're going to get better at it is by doing it. So with this, think of other real world decisions that adolescents are facing. So we see that sensation seeking and poor decision making and risky decision making are happening in adolescence. But what other decisions are adolescents making at this time? So pause the video, write a couple things in your notes. All right, another thing that we see getting better across the lifespan is critical thinking. So adolescents with their new capacities in executive functioning are doing a lot better at examining facts, judging them, seeing if evidence supports them. Oftentimes they're a lot more reflective, they're a lot more productive in discussions, asking questions about things, and you can see this in other children as well. But we see a lot more on average in adolescence, and then this is getting better into adulthood as well. So oftentimes, critical thinking in adolescence is still really self-serving. So with that, they're still like thinking more about their own self, as we've talked about in other chapters, especially in socio-emotional chapters, or maybe we will get to depending on how the class is structured for you. Adolescents are very self-focused, and this is just part of their brain development and part of their identity development. They're very concerned that other people might be watching them. What do people think? Does everybody see this zit on my face? Those are really common things, and a kind of I can't remember the term. Imaginary audience. A lot of adolescents have the sense of there's an imaginary audience, there's people that are watching them, but interestingly, other adolescents are thinking the same thing at the same time. So all of this is getting better across adolescence. So this is also a time in late childhood to adolescence that we first see the development of expertise. So oftentimes it does happen later, but this is kind of the first time it could appear. So an expert is kind of what we consider the person who's practiced something for 10,000 hours. So that is expertise. When you have a lot of practice with something, then you are going to become more expert at it. You will have a lot of brain networks around this kind of thing. So you can solve a relevant problem. You can reason about a topic faster and more easily because you have so many things to connect to it. So in late childhood, adolescence, those are basically the first time we ever see experts in any given topic. So again, for most people, these expertises don't appear till later in life, but that's the earliest it basically can happen in the lifespan. So as we jump towards late adulthood, from adolescence through basically late adulthood, a lot of those executive functioning capacities stay pretty consistent over time. And even in late adulthood, if we're continuing to use them, they will stay good still. So executive functioning for working memory can decline later on in adulthood. We see that later adults are updating memory representations that are relevant for the task at hand. So they have ideas of how things should be done, and with executive functioning, they can update that. Maybe there's no new tools, new technologies, for example. We also see decision making is one of those executive functioning skills that stays pretty good across our late adulthood. So mental activities can really benefit the maintenance of these cognitive skills. Word searches, Sudoku, crossword puzzles, going to new lectures to learn things, going to concerts. Mental exercises can either reduce, delay, maintain your cognitive abilities so they decline slower, and they also lower the likelihood of Alzheimer's disease. So it is a neurodegenerative illness. So if you do have Alzheimer's disease, eventually it's going to deteriorate things, but these kind of cognitive activities can slow the stem of those changes across time. So one thing to remember is just like our thing on health and well-being in late adulthood. Do cognitive skills. To improve those skills, you will expect some loss of plasticity in very late adulthood. But if you're doing cognitive fitness training, if you're playing games, if you're going to lectures, if you're trying to learn a new language, if you're exercising, all of these things will help. And there's a couple different vitamins and minerals and things like omega-3 fish oils and fatty acids that can also help with the brain and the things that the neurons actually need. So the theory of mind is another aspect of our information processing. So it is our own, it's basically what we define as our understanding that we as an individual think, feel, and perceive differently than other people, realizing that what other people see and think is different than how we might see and think. So as you're driving down the road looking into a car, that person is having a completely different experience to what you're having. Maybe they're having a great day, maybe they're having a terrible day, maybe they're having the best day of their life, maybe they're having the worst day of their life. Maybe they're anxious that they need to get home in time to change for a date, right? They're having their own life experience, and the way that they are perceiving things around them can be very different than the way you are perceiving things around yourself. So this does seem to emerge between the ages of about 3 or 4. There's suggestions that it might be a little bit into our genetics with a theory of mind mechanism, but it is a little unclear. But it does seem that the brain wiring up and having experience with other people in social interactions, seeing different perspectives, reading books can really help the theory of mind develop. So with this, again, when we're looking at children that are 3 and 4 or younger, we've really got these observational and behavioral methods. So it can be difficult to see, but we see that children who talk with parents about their emotions frequently, so like the parents are sharing their emotions, the children are sharing theirs, they do better at theory of mind tasks, even at age 2. We see children who read books that talk about the inner workings, like what is the person, the character in the book thinking about, worried about, doing things like that helps give them that perspective already, helps start wiring their brain up to understand that other people are perceiving things differently than them. And this is also related to better executive functioning. So it helps with your planning again, your inhibition, your goals. When you have better executive functioning, those prefrontal cortex areas, you have better theory of mind. So a lot of that's down to prefrontal cortex. And again, practice can make it better. So again, prefrontal cortex development is very central to our development of theory of the mind. It's very central to our working memory, trying to take someone else's perspective. And theory of mind and some of these capacities are really important for one of my favorite emotions, empathy. Empathy is both feeling what someone is feeling as well as taking their perspective. So theory of mind is really important in that, is putting yourself kind of in their shoes. How would they feel in this situation? That is a big part of empathy. And it's a pretty complex process. We can actually feel the emotions other people feel pretty early on, like even right after birth. We can kind of share emotions that way. But to be able to take the perspective of someone else takes this practice, takes your prefrontal cortex, and you having the time and opportunity, the people to practice it with you, that kind of thing. And so at any given point in time, you can get better at that. So with that, I do want to share a bunch of different memory strategies. We've shared a few of them, some of these that you'll see right here, we've already touched on. But as we're talking about information processing and memory, this is really relevant in a school setting, right? So you're in school, you are learning, you are building your knowledge in an area. One of the memory strategies that you can use is elaboration. So think of examples. So sometimes in my lectures, in my videos, I'll say, so think of how this applies to your life. I'm trying to get you to elaborate. So build on the info. So with that, mental imagery is another good one. I described my examples of how I've used mental imagery in that video on working memory. So let's see, it's been a couple minutes since that happened now. Let's see if I can remember all 5 words. We've got a tree along a highway, and in the mirror, I see Saturn and its electrode. And hey, it's a kind of purpley pink image in my mind, like a synthwave album cover. So I did remember all 5 of them. I'm pretty sure that was them. I might have switched around Saturn and mirror, but I think I got it correct. So this works better. This imagery works better for older children than younger children. So as we get practice with doing more imagery, we'll get better and better at it. Again, any of these mnemonics that we've talked about, the first time you try it, it might take some cognitive energy, but as you try it more and more, it'll take less and less because your brain gets better at doing it. Another big thing, especially in school settings, is try to understand the material rather than just memorizing it. So you can relist or memorize and rehearse the material, but try to make it meaningful, try to make it personal, try to elaborate on it, try to understand what's going on, the processes, connect what we're talking about with memory to things that we've talked about with learning to late adulthood. Making those connections will help you, one, understand the material and keep it in your memory better. So there are really 5 things that kind of cause us to forget. One is encoding failures. We just didn't really learn the information well in the first place. We didn't connect it up enough. The hippocampus can't find that information to then call up that memory. Another is decay. Memories do fade over time. So that's why if you try to think of your 5th versus 6th versus 7th birthday parties, you might not be able to remember those. It might be too long. You haven't recalled that memory enough, so that memory has just kind of gone away. Another one is inadequate retrieval cues. You don't have enough things to trigger that memory. So maybe you haven't been recalling it enough. If you had recalled it more, if you'd connected it to more things, you might be able to call on that. So you might remember, oh, I know I did read something about that, but I can't remember what it was. That might be inadequate retrieval cues. You didn't connect it to enough other information, so you don't have enough neurons trying to activate that memory. Interference is when other memories kind of get in the way of that memory. So if there's 2 similar memories, I think I gave an example earlier today of I'm not sure if my first memory is from when I was 4 or 5 in a camping trip. Well, both those memories are kind of mixed up now. They're interfering with each other. And then trying not to remember, if we deliberately try to push things out of our mind, our neurons will learn that we're trying to avoid that, and they'll learn a new pattern of avoiding that memory. So that could be an example of active repression of some memories. And repression can also happen unintentionally too. Another big thing to know is this Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. I believe this is in your textbook as well. I always try to bring it up when we're talking about memory, but this is the dramatic example of how quickly we forget things when we've learned them. So the things that you heard about 20 minutes ago in this lecture, you've probably forgotten almost 50% of them already. An hour after the lecture, you're remembering only about 40% of them. By tomorrow, you'll remember about 30% of the things that you learned today. Unless you try to elaborate on it, unless you try that mental imagery, unless you review your notes, and then this changes. If you do reviewing, the curve changes to this. It flattens out. So if you review things the day after, then a couple days after, and then again a couple days after that, you will remember, and this forgetting curve still happens, but the slope smooths out. But yeah, it's a pretty dramatic thing, about a 50% loss after 20 minutes, and then about a 70% loss after 24 hours. So reviewing your notes, this is also why I tell all of my classes, well, hey, read the book before you come to class. Read the book, then you're getting all 100% of the information. Then when you come to class, you're reviewing a lot of things. And so that forgetting curve is now less steep for you because you had read the book already. Then if you review your notes, that is way less steep, right? And then a positive thing with the forgetting curve, though, I will say, is looking at this, if you are remembering something for about a week, those things do tend to stay. So if you remember now something from a week ago, that's probably a lot more likely to stay in your mind. All right, so another couple memory errors are listed here on the slide. So I'm sure you've had some of these experiences, like things being on the tip of your tongue. That is, the accessibility of the information is temporarily blocked, and that could be from a variety of things. All of these could be caused by neurotransmitters not quite working correctly. It could be because you're a little too tired, there's more distractions, you don't have the retrieval cues. All of these things kind of put together can lead to some of these memory errors. So with this, elaboration, mental imagery, understanding the material, these are all very important pieces to try and remember. Another couple memory study tips is to review your notes, to look for errors in your notes, to add to your notes after you've gone through. So you take notes during reading, then you take notes during class, you make additions, changes, arrange things in memorable structures, use the method of loci. You can also try different variety of techniques. Use hierarchies in your notes where it's like, this is the big concept, these are the sub-concepts. You can use networks, so thought bubbles, like this thought and this thought are connected together. Make analogies to things familiar to you. As you're studying, especially, give undivided attention. So you might have to put your phone on silent, turn off Netflix in the background, right? So we can't actually multitask as humans. Our working memory, to be cognitively intensively focused on something, we can't do two things at once. So for study, give undivided attention. You're more likely to get that material into long-term memory. Processing deeply through these elaboration methods and other mnemonics. Make connections. So that's associations. Make connections with other things. Use imagery, use chunking, put a couple things together, and try to do this encoding early and often. Rehearsing is good too. Redo your notes. Before the exam, it's a really good idea to write all of your notes into a single page of notes that you think are the most important or the things you're going to forget. That will help you on the test. In some of your classes, you might be able to take that page of notes. But often what you'll find is since you've reviewed and you've redone your notes, you won't actually have to refer to that. You will remember it so much better. Talk to others, test yourself, make up multiple choice tests. You can make your own flashcards online pretty easily with, say, vocab for classes. Essay questions are really good too. You could ask your friends to make up essay questions. You could ask ChatGPT to make up essay questions for you to practice. It might do a better job than some of your friends at doing that. Take breaks during your study. So we remember the first things that we study and the things that we last study the best. So if you're taking breaks every 15 or so minutes, you will be able to remember that stuff better than if you have a big chunk of study, like if you've studied for 2 hours, that middle portion, it's a long portion, you might not remember it as well. Another thing, use retrieval clues. So things like the room that you studied in, if you can take a test in that same room, and try to keep comfortable, keep calm, eat well, sleep well. These will help with your memory. So some other things that came straight from a book slide. There are a couple other topics here. Keep moving is a good one we didn't really talk about. Yeah, other than that, we did mention these in other formats. Yeah, doing exercise can help as well. So this is a good video if you want to review any of the topics that we've talked about. That being said, you don't have to watch this video. It has a little bit more focus on study tips as well, but it's not required for the class to do this video, but it's a helpful resource. So hopefully you have a lot better idea of things that you can do for your memory to improve it, how it works, and how it's related to, especially our working memory is so related to everything that we do in life. And you have a better understanding of all of the information that your brain is processing all of the time.